movie podcast on the Bloody Disgusting Podcast Network. I'm one of your hosts, Prince, also known as Head Knight, and alongside me we got David.
Your favorite horror virgin, hopefully.
Hopefully. Also known as Nightly. On the other end there, we got Freddie.
Always keeping it spoopy.
Always and forever. Also known as Nighty Night. This is a very, very special episode for our friends over at Panic Fest. Thank you so much for pretty much having us on this whole little spiel here. Honestly, seriously, this is really, really fucking cool. Thank you all so much. We hope you have a really, really great time watching the festival. Have a great time watching us. We have some fun topics, and we're just going to dive right into that. Because one in particular topic that we do have that is honestly really, really on my mind a lot lately. What do you feel about children in horror? Does it make it scarier?
I want to jump in really quick.
Yeah,
I love
throw it in there. Throw the kid in the pool.
For some reason, what?
This is Panic Fest. No, I'm just kidding.
I love children in horror. I think I only really love it because people generally do find it horrific, right? And
That's fair.
I think the reason why we find it horrific is because of so many establishments that have come and gone with establishing that kids can be creepy, right?
Right.
I think people find children creepy because they've been conditioned to believe that it's creepy. And I want to actually dive in with that. And I want to see your guys' perspective on that.
That's
because
fair.
I think when people, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but when people think of the origin of what made children scary and horror, people always think of like Children of the Corn.
That's fair.
Yeah. And I think that's where it started, and it really built up from there.
Now, are you thinking this in the aspect of children specifically being like the villain, or are you thinking this as in just like children in general? Like, because I'm thinking in the context of both, where villains or villainizing kids, and also we are trying to protect them as well. So I think like I immediately go to probably one of the most perfect analysis for me would be The Orphan. When you have this context of a child who is a villain who turns out to not be a child, besides the point. And then you have these two kids who are very vulnerable. One's deaf, and the other one he's kind of a prick, but he's still really vulnerable because he doesn't want this new sister. He doesn't want this person to be in his family. And it's interesting because I do find kids to make certain aspects of horror to be, I guess, not necessarily scarier, but it definitely drives your empathy up a little bit more. And I think with that context, you get other types of aspirations like, 1997 or 1977's Eraserhead, for example, where it has a literal fetus in the film, and you just feel everything. Like you it's gorgeous, it's disturbing, it's weird, and yet you feel for it.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that horror has that aspect, especially when you bring kids into the equation of any kind. I mean, it's very intriguing to make kids scary.
Yeah. I think it comes from an approach of, and you asked earlier, are we looking as children being the villain, right? In these films? And I think it's a representation of what could be truly twisted, right? Yeah. Because, when you think of children, you think that they're so pure. And to be taken and to be twisted into something evil, it's so it's disturbing, but it has such an impact on that.
Yeah.
Because we could all relate on that level where, most of us know a child or have been in contact with children, right? And especially young children at that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why you have a large genre, and I think of Japanese horror, right, where young children that are girls are depicted as very scary because, especially in some cultures, like young girls are seen as so pure and sweet at times, right? And to take that and create this evil entity within them and show the contrast of that, can be truly terrifying for some people. Because you have people that may not be too into horror, and they see the go-tos for mainstream audiences like The Ring. And that is something that establishes for a lot of people that, you know what, this scares me. And when I think of scary children, it brings me back to something like The Ring that I experienced, right? And that's for more mainstream audiences.
Sure.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it makes total sense to think of it, especially when you contextualize it that way, where The Ring itself is utilizing kids in a very interesting way, where we have these ghost children and that meow. But with that aspect of these particular children in that situation, or children scaring adults or anything like that, there's this one movie that really comes to mind. It's literally called Children, and it's pretty much about these kids who kind of get like this flu or sickness or something that kind of just turns them into killing their parents. And it's actually a really fun movie.
Yeah.
But
it sounds so much
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it also reminds me of Elijah Wood's Cooties. I don't know if you guys have seen that too, but Cooties is another context of, it's these teachers and the kids go fucking nuts, and they're like preschoolers. they're not preschoolers, but they're like elementary school, and like they have to kill these kids. And that's one of those things where you think, like, morally, can I do that?
Yeah.
Where, like, as you could do it, or just like you're.
No, I mean,
it's situational, right? It depends.
It's a dilemma, right? Because it's really good context to bring up.
Yeah.
Because if, let's say you're faced with an evil entity that is very clearly an adult, it's self-defense, right? But when you're faced with a child that is the villain of this horror story, there's confliction on top of that, and that makes it more intrinsic and more interesting to tackle on a thematic level.
That is very true. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I love when directors such as James Wan and even I would even go as far as talking about David Fincher and just all these brilliant minds who incorporate children. Because I don't know if you have either of you seen Mindhunter?
Yeah, a little bit of it.
A little bit
I'm
of it.
not.
You haven't? Have you seen season 2 at all?
Bits
Freddie?
and pieces.
Okay.
A little bit of it.
Season 2 delves into a child murderer, and not as in a person who murders children, like literally a child who's becoming a psychopath.
Oh, wow.
And it is so intriguing how they incorporate those types of things into their films. And
it's very interesting because also there's a movie called The Good Son that kind of dives deep into that.
Mm-hmm. Macaulay Culkin and Elijah Wood.
Right.
Yeah. The Good Son's great. That came out in the either early 90s or late 80s.
Right. And I guess another popular reference would be like The Omen being a child murderer in a way.
Yeah. Even though I guess Damien doesn't technically murder anyone.
At least he has like
there's things that
supernatural
murder stuff for
abilities
him.
around him.
Yeah.
That makes
he
him
murders
a
people when
murderer.
he's older.
That's true
like
too.
The heretic and shit. But.
One thing I do want to add is that I think is really interesting when we look at children in horror, right? And especially when they're presented as the villain, is what got them to that point. And a lot of times it's the horrors within their waking life, their living life, right? That have brought them to stay around and torment, right? I think of The Changeling. And that's
good call.
Nice. Wow. Right? Yeah.
Where the entity that you're facing is a child, yet a lot of times you can't see the child, right? But there's this sense of dread.
Yeah.
Whenever you do face the wheelchair at the top of the staircase, or
The
seeing
ball dropping.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh
right?
man, The Changeling's great.
Exactly. And you bring up a really good point, Prince, with the ball dropping, right? Because that's so synonymous with children, right? Where you see a ball bouncing and you think, oh, a child nearby is playing, but I think that is something that has become creepy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Ghosts
it's
are scary.
But yeah, going to my main point, these children go through such horrific traumatic events in their living life where it brings them to become the villain. And I think that is what makes it truly interesting. And you guys know this because you know me. That's truly terrifying for me for children to go through that and to really express their pain in the afterlife. And so much so that they have to basically attack others, right? Because of the pain that they experience, and that's all they know.
Right. Now, the reason why I even bring this topic up, especially for all of us, is, as you know, as all of you know, I'm a new father, and it's something that's been on my mind very much recently with children in horror in general. And with these particular children that we have showcased in horror, and how they interact in horror, and how they are perceived in horror, like you stated earlier, David, you claimed the vulnerability behind it with children is very intriguing, but at the same time it has us be a little bit more empathetic. But when you bring up something like The Good Son, then you have this very cry wolf situation where it's just like, well, is this kid good or is he fucking the devil? You think of like Problem Child, for example, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
So it's always, and I love that type of horror right now because, and we don't get it a lot, but I love that type of horror because that's every parent's nightmare. What is my child going to grow up to be?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that, I know that's something I'm afraid of. Like, it's just like if I one day wake up and my daughter's like pulling, like, I don't know, like doll hairs out of her doll, and I'm just like, what are you doing? And she's like, she looks better this way.
Yeah, of
like,
course.
oh my God.
No, I mean, yeah, kids are weird, right?
Yes, they are.
Especially through their development stages.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you're totally right on, Prince. I mean, I don't have a child, so I can't really can't correlate my feelings towards it because
Sure.
I'm not a father, but
yet you feel empathetic towards children because you find them vulnerable.
yeah,
Exactly.
But I wonder, like, I mean, have you, since the birth of your daughter, have you watched much horror with children in it? Because
Yes.
I wonder if it does it impact you differently.
That's a great question. It does and it doesn't. So with horror in general, when it comes to children being involved in it, if like a kid gets hurt, it doesn't really faze me that often.
Yeah.
And it still doesn't really faze me that often. It's more so when you see the children have some type of psychotic break that kind of gets to me.
Yeah.
So bringing up, and I know we keep bringing up The Good Son, but that's like probably the most predominant one that I can think of when you brought
course.
that up. But even if we think about The Orphan, like, this is someone who definitely seemed harmless in The Orphan, and it turns out that this person was fucking crazy and trying to seduce a like 40-year-old man, and it's just things got weird.
Yeah.
And you think about that kind of stuff differently when you see that on screen, and you're just like, yeah, that makes me feel even more uncomfortable now, like when seeing that type of stuff on screen. But like when I see a child or something like get hurt in a film, or if a child is the main subject in the film, it doesn't get to me that much, or it doesn't really scar me like how it will in other depictions of horror. And another example I can think of is Mike Flanagan's Doctor Strange of 2019. And there's such a horrific moment in that film that has to deal with a child that is heartbreaking. And it's extremely hard to watch too. And it's something that I have seen Dr. Sleep so many times that still technically phases me, but it's because mainly I think what's his name, Jacob Tremblay, I think his name is.
Fantastic actor
such a
too.
great actor.
And at least for me, that's where it kind of hits hard, where there's these child actors who are really good at what they do.
It's terrifying that they're that good.
It's all about the perspective of kids, right? We see them playing around, we see them having fun, they're doing innocent stuff. And what horror movies do with children is that they violate that innocence, and we see that in The Exorcism, and The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And we see someone who's not a child anymore.
Yeah.
That is some completely different entity, and it becomes an antagonist that they have to really fight against.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking to see this child and this person's inside the child's body, a demon so powerful and so demonic that you only feel sympathy and empathy for. And it's that violation of innocence that always gets me in horror movies. Whether they are the antagonists or they're the ones that are being victimized inside the movie.
Right.
We see, of course, Pet Sematary. We see what happens in those events at the very beginning of the movie.
Pet Sematary is one
back.
that kind of makes me think about it a lot because it's just like, I mean, it's such a tragic beginning in Pet Sematary, and I wouldn't know what I would do if my child died.
Obviously, it hits hard seeing that kind of stuff.
It does. That definitely does hit harder every time I think about Pet Sematary.
And
it's one of the reasons why I keep taking it off our list.
David came up with a really good point about like traumatic events maybe causing these impressions on kids to further down the mental path of something sad, at least.
Yeah.
And the movie that really resonates with me too is kind of The Ring. Yeah. Where she was a kind person who was just different and was misunderstood. Yeah. And she got the short end of the stick where her parents did unspeakable acts to her. And that caused a ripple effect. And it's kind of heartbreaking to see. But at the same time, she's terrifying because of that innocence being lost.
Right.
It's interesting because most films really try to help you cope when something bad happens to a character, right?
Right.
They usually set them up to be a jerk. Or deserving of some type of repercussion, right? But I think what's truly tough for children in horror stories is they're usually characters that don't deserve it.
Yeah.
And it makes it that much more heart-wrenching to watch, right?
Yeah.
And tougher to grasp. And I actually really appreciate that when it comes to children in horror because as we bring up this topic, I start to realize, like, that's actually, like, something that I go to quite frequently because it makes me empathize, it makes me feel just, melancholy about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Which makes total sense. I mean, it's kids.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like, but here's the thing too. Like, even if we were to span this from not just young children, if we were to span this to teenagers, does your vision change?
A little bit.
It definitely does for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
That's
strange.
interesting.
It's strange to say because I think it comes back to that conversation that we were speaking about innocence, right? And
yeah, I guess because I mean, the fruit of the labor could definitely be turned to maybe someone who's no longer a virgin, and maybe there's other people who like think of other things, and it's very telling when things like that are considered. But I mean, that definitely is what sparks the whole slashers, right? I mean, it's teenagers doing
Scream and stuff like that.
Right.
What you did last summer, and usually it's the actions that teenagers do. with kids, it's like it's unwarranted. It's things just happen to them. And it's undeserving. But when it's like a teenager, sometimes like, you know what, you kind of deserve it. Like there's like tropes, right? Where it's don't break these rules or else you are gonna end up being dead. Yeah. There's kind of like a guideline to it. But when it comes to kids, it's something where it's like you want to protect them, and we see great ensembles of kids too. I always want to bring up It and how scary it is for them, but it's also empowering of these kids coming together and fighting this evil as well. So it could be empowering as well. Yeah. But does that make the movie scarier? I think so still. Even though there are powerful characters who team up, them being kids still has the effect of them having that innocence, and they have this playfulness, and they're experiencing so many tragic moments through their entire runtime of that movie.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, that's why I always think back, like, okay, kids being vulnerable and being mistreated in horror or anything like that, and even bringing up The Exorcist. What makes The Exorcist so horrible is pretty much William Friedkin. The way he directed in that movie was so terrible,
unorthodox for sure.
I don't even know if you could, it should be illegal. Yeah, like, and it's just with the machine, and it actually literally breaking Linda Blair's back, and it's just it's stuff like that where just like an actual child got hurt. Yeah, but at the same time, I was a teenager. Yeah. So like it's things like that where you think of this whole aspect of, okay, I have to protect this child, and once they're a teenager, you're on your own kind of concept. But when you are thinking of, I have to protect this child, what makes that fascinating, what happens when the child turns on you?
Right.
So it's just that whole thing gets thrown out of the window, and you see this in another Mike Flanagan film, Ouija, Origin of Evil.
Love if you haven't watched those movies,
They're a blast.
They're a blast.
They're a blast. In Ouija, Origin of Evil, you see this girl just be absolutely like terrifying once this demon is inside of her, who she thinks is her imaginary friend that she called from her. Oh my god, amazing! That's fucking just chef kiss. I love that movie. But it's stuff like that, and then you take it on, and I know you didn't watch this for our regular scheduled programming, David, but Gerald's Game,
Right.
where things as a child happen in that film, and things that were known were happening, and it was child molestation, and things that were known from her mom, yet she didn't do anything. And that's one of those concepts where I always think back, as in like, when is it when we can say, okay, I want to try to 100% save this child no matter what.
Yeah.
And then the other spectrum is like, all right, fuck these kids.
You know, it's funny because when we started this conversation, I was like, that phrase is going to come up.
It is,
fuck
yeah.
these kids,
Fuck
right?
these kids.
Because I think what really matters there is your connection to said child, right?
Yeah.
Because I think if it's someone that you don't have too strong of a connection with, fuck these kids, right? I'm gonna fight this kid.
Right.
But if it's a family member or someone that you love, right? It's tough just giving up.
Right.
And saying that person's gone and it's
sense.
no longer them, right? Because when you have that connection with somebody, you're going to do whatever you can to save them. And I think Ouija is a really good movie to bring up because from when I watched that movie, it's been a while now, but I remember feeling like that character was gone.
Yeah.
Right? And the character does such a good job of portraying that they have become this different entity, this different powerful entity that is totally in control. What do you do there when you're faced with that situation, right?
That's what I'm saying. And same concept goes into like sharp objects. And I think both of you haven't seen that, right? But so, which is totally fine. It's actually a fantastically dreadful show, and it's also made by Blumhouse, which was also fantastic. But it's on HBO, and it follows kids, but they're teenagers. But yet you still feel this empathy because other shit is happening to them.
Yeah.
Even though it's this whole cause and effect thing, but other things are happening to them to make you feel like, I feel terrible for this kid. And I think that same thing kind of goes into like Euphoria and also other stuff. But, these are teenagers that you literally feel bad for. And I think the reason why you feel bad for them in those situations is because it's grounded.
Yeah.
And when you think of it in a slasher term, it's not as grounded in reality to where you're just like, well, fuck these kids. Like,
you guys know that I love to call it the decades.
Right, yeah.
Right? And I think when you're looking at the 90s and you have your slasher films and they're very teenage focused, don't get me wrong, these teenagers are portrayed to be a lot more mature than teenagers actually are, right? And it's tough because you have a broad spectrum. You have like those towards the younger frame of being a teenager, like 13 up, and then you have 17 that through film are very much depicted as adults, with both males and females, right? Males really macho and kind of toxicity so. I don't even know if that's a word.
Yeah, I don't know. Toxicity?
Well, I wanted to use like a different phrase of
Toxicity.
Yeah.
We're making up words.
Yeah, we definitely are. And you have teenage girls that are sexualized, right? And shown to be a lot more mature than they actually
Thank
probably
you,
are.
Riverdale.
Exactly. But I think about like, I know what you did last summer, Scream, so on.
Right,
But I
of course.
think that era really depicted them that way, and not all too likable. So it's easier to see them get killed on screen, right?
Yeah.
And I think we've moved past that. Surely there are still stories that portray characters that way. But it goes back to, a point I made earlier in the conversation where typically in film you create this unlikable character so it's easy to see them get killed on screen. But that isn't done for young children in horror. It very much wants you to feel pity.
Yeah.
100%.
So I think the teenage approach is very interesting, right? Because I think that's more so, and I could be wrong, right? Because on this spectrum of what I'm about to speak on, I'm not really knowledgeable on, but I feel like those are decisions that are made to get more people into the box office, to feel like they can connect. Like, I'm a high schooler. Let me go watch this film about other high schoolers get slashed up and like, oh, those people suck.
Exactly.
It's interesting because like I was having a chat with a buddy of ours, Corey, and she is
fantastic.
She's great.
Yeah, she's great.
And she is a Gen Z. So I asking her questions based on what is your horror right now? Like what did you grow up on?
Yeah.
And I mean, she was bummed when I asked her because it was just like not much. Because what I typically grew up on was American Horror Story, or it was like, I don't know, like pretty much what we're watching now. It's just it was nothing that she can truly connect to. Right. So like for her with Riverdale or Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and things like that, which are fun, but at the same time, those particular depictions are very fantasized.
Yeah.
Like you get that fantasy aspect of everyone looks fucking beautiful. And you have other aspects of it where it's just like, okay, they're pretty. Where are their flaws? And then they'll tell you the flaws. And the flaws are very makeup still.
Yeah.
Right.
You're just like, that's a stupid flaw. You should be, what? You got webbed feet and you're fucking freaking out about webbed feet? Get out of here. So it's like, it's stuff like that, you know, that I feel bad for the kids that are now. And that's why I love things like Freaky and Happy Death Day and stuff like that, where you're now getting this depiction of like how kids are today. And how like, because for us almost in our 30s, we have that aspect of where for us it's probably not going to hit as well. Yeah, for us, right? Where we'll see things like in Freaky, where it's just like, I thought they were like interesting choices for certain things because I was just like, I don't think I just understand it. Like, I'm not a part of that age group.
Exactly.
It's not for me.
It's adapted to this generation, which is perfect because, like I was saying with like teenager horror movies, it feels like it follows a standard storyline and it has those tropes that keeps going at it and at it and at it, and it's, you know, it's standard. But with the movies like Freaky, they kind of turn those tropes and they're self-aware of it and they turn it on its head. Right. Which is perfect. And with like, I guess with children in horror movies, it becomes more unconventional. They can move it into different ways because it's losing that innocence and it's doing that violation for them. And also it makes them into an adult-like situation. Like the movie I always resonate with, and it's a movie that we covered, is Tigers Are Not Afraid by Isa Lopez.
I knew you were gonna bring it up.
Which is
don't hurt me.
It's so heartbreaking seeing these kids because they have to grow up very quickly in an environment that needs that to happen. They lose their innocence right away, not because of what's going on in the movie itself, because they are living in an area where that needs to be done for survival. Yeah. And then we get the horror fantasy elements into it as well. Yeah. Where that doesn't really happen too much in like teenager movies or what I mean,
in kid films, because I think that's what made Isa Lopez's films so interesting and different was because these kids were literally alone.
Exactly.
And you couldn't help but to feel vulnerable, but at the same time, you're just like, who's going to protect these kids? When in reality, they had to just protect themselves, and we had to just, as an audience, just deal with that. Now, going about a little bit deeper with our talk on the children.
The kids.
Them kids.
Yeah, them kids.
Now, I brought up James Wan as one of the directors earlier, and I want to actually expand on that because I feel like most of his films have truly transpired children to be, I guess, a bona fide portion to his movies, where you have not necessarily Saw per se, but Saw 2, for example, but you have Insidious, the Conjuring universe. Literally everything's about a kid in the Conjuring universe. Yeah, it is pretty great. And then you also have one of his more, like, I guess, less well-known films, Dead Silence and Death Sentence, where both of these films, and Death Sentence to me is even more horrible because it's actually a teenage kid. And it's
Right.
a teenage kid who definitely, I don't think I've ever felt more empathy for Kevin Bacon as much as I did in Silent Death Sentence. But I'm serious. Like, it's just so interesting how James Wan has created this world around children horror or surrounded around children. And I'm very excited to see what Malignant's going to do. And I doubt it would be children in that based off of the premise itself. But I'm intrigued. I'm really intrigued to see how this works because I feel like he works so well in making children scared. Not necessarily scary, but it really puts us on edge as a crowd of audience members who like horror, especially with like Dead Silence. And I don't even think you've seen Dead Silence, have you?
No, I haven't.
Have you seen Dead
I
Silence?
have.
Okay, so
Yeah. The one with the puppet,
are you
right?
familiar with it?
I'm not.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's take it back a little bit here because this will actually go into the conversation. Dead Silence is, yes, Freddie, you're right. It is about a puppet or a ventriloquist named Mary Shaw.
I'm in.
And it's technically based in the current times of at that time, which was around maybe 2007. Okay. This movie was gradually hated, but the unrated version was also just as hated. I've always loved it.
Yeah.
And now it's found a home. It's found a home in the more modern audiences of horror and things like that. But Mary Shaw was such an interesting and fascinating character that she was just the perfect villain because she utilized these dolls. And she even had her own fucking poem. Beware the stare of Mary Shaw. She had no children, only doll. If you see her in your dreams, she'll rip your tongue out from the seam.
It's a good poem.
It's a great poem. And right off the cusp of my head there. But that's how much it stuck with me, right? And she would do these things and have the interaction be where, and it's not many children involved. It's just the fact that you have these dolls that are considered the children of the story.
Mm.
And it's such a fascinating take on a villain and a ghost story.
Yeah.
And I think this was James Wan's first ghost story. And if it would have gotten a lot of love that it deserved, in my opinion, that would have been his first universe for sure. Like it definitely would have, to me, it is much better than Insidious. It's much better than The Conjuring. I love that movie.
I mean, genuinely so. Like, the premise that you just explained has me very interested.
It's on our list, so be on the lookout. But it's on our list. But with that being said, like it is one of those things that really has you kind of think of just children in a very interesting way, in a very meticulous way, and I think Dead Silence plays on that very interestingly because of how the children are depicted in this particular film are wooden puppets. But at the same time, with the whole taking of the tongue and things like that, and stilling it's about pretty much stilling the voice once the tongue is taken.
Yeah.
And once that tongue is taken, it is interesting that they're all her children.
Mm-hmm.
And
because they can't say otherwise.
Right. And what makes this fascinating is we're thinking in the context of kids, but I did say the context of children. Mm-hmm. We're all someone's child.
Yeah.
So think of it in that context of as an older person, like how do you feel empathy for someone in that context of that's someone's child?
You bring up an interesting point earlier where you spoke about, James Wan being very good at scaring children.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of unlocked the door for me of understanding why I'm very much gravitated towards his films and his universes. Because I think when these stories play out and you see these children getting scared, being in terrifying situations, I kind of see myself still as a child in those moments, right? And I think that's super intriguing because you bring up that we're all someone's child, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we could get a lot older and older and older, but we're still going to have, most of us, are going to have our parents that we think of being part of a family and so on. and it can bring you back to those moments, and
Right.
you really think about how for generations and generations, horror was used to really teach children lessons.
Yeah,
and
still is.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
scaring them from not making the right decision.
Yeah. I mean,
So-
you take certain folklores that
Mhm.
are utilized within to scare children as these cautionary tales.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's great. It's really beautiful to think that horror has come so far from Aesop fables to grim fairy tales to and grim fairy tales especially, because you got Hansel and Gretel and you got
Yeah.
just so many intriguing stories out of it all, and I love seeing those stories come to life. And I would love to see James Wan just like tackle a folk horror just so
Imagine
bad. Like,
That'd be
like
great.
I feel like he would just fucking nail it. And he's from New Zealand, so I know like there's some fucking twisted stories out there. So with that being said, though, like it's so fascinating if we were to even take the context. And let's talk about The Conjuring and Insidious a little bit, because I feel like that's the ones that really pivot the most towards children.
Yeah.
Right.
Where the first Conjuring, oh my gosh, was
Masterpiece
even,
in my eyes.
It is a fucking damn good
One of my
movie.
Yeah.
favorites.
But with The Conjuring, it is so interesting because you have multiple children.
Mhm.
Now, here's the thing that can seem even more interesting, and it was sort of filmed this way, that it was very apparent that they were all women.
Yep.
And they were all women with a dad that was constantly gone.
Yep.
Because his job was on the road.
Mhm.
And it was very apparent that like they had to kind of fend for themselves in certain situations. But it's interesting because I wonder if that had something to do with the aspect of us trying as an audience member feeling scared, or feeling the fact that they are not just kids or children or teenagers, but they're kids, children, teenagers that are also women inside of this very mysterious world that they're currently living in. So it's interesting, and that was my only like main gripe with it. I didn't like how damsel in distress they felt in certain points.
Yeah.
I didn't have it like that vibe. I thought they were very powerful together because you really see their sisterhood.
Together.
That's true, I guess. to extend a little bit, the mom, the connection with her daughter and stuff like that. And you brought up a really good point earlier too. It's like, well, or I think both of you guys did, of what would you do if your own child was in this situation? And she would sacrifice herself for her own child, essentially. The
Well, I
thing
think-
that
I
brings
think
her
that was,
back
like,
from the exorcism is the memory of the family being together and
Right at the beach.
saving her own child and stuff like that. She would do
Yeah.
anything for her family, essentially.
Right.
I see it as the main mom being the main protagonist of everything. Even though she's going through all of the bigger occurrences and she's the one that's being possessed at that moment, even with the quote unquote man of the house is gone, she's the one that kind of takes care of everything, and she's the one that does the final resolution of everything too. She battles
Yeah.
through everything and
Roger's
she overcomes
there.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's more of just like, I don't want to say side character, but in the same way. Yeah, side character.
Damn shit.
She's the one that goes, no, but she goes through all the shit, and she's the one that
Right.
comes over everything.
Well, let's talk about The Conjuring 2 then. Because with The Conjuring 2, you have two sisters,
Right.
and then you have a younger brother.
Mhm.
So with that context now, and you don't have a dad at all. It's a single mom.
Yeah.
So it's that same kind of concept where it's just like, oh, the younger brother is their younger brother who's literally 3 or 4
Right.
in the situation with these 11 and 12-year-olds. And it just makes me interested into and obviously the main reason why is because these were based on true stories or whatever, and that's just how it was. But with the way that these are filmed and perceived and things like that, and it's very intriguing because you get Bathsheba in the first one,
Mhm.
and then in the second one you get the nun, which was Valak.
Yep. Valak.
And with Valak being the one that entirely took over the kid in this one, and her mom wasn't the one to save her in that one.
Mhm.
So it's very interesting that, I mean, in reality, the hero is
The Warrens.
not even the Warrens. It's like literally just Elaine.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Lorraine
Lorraine
Warren.
Warren.
Like it was literally just Lorraine. Like she's the hero here, and like Ed is the side character.
That's true too.
So it's interesting when you see it in that particular context because, like I stated earlier, James Wan is really good at making kids scared. And
I do want to add in because, and I want to speak on Conjuring 1 and 2 because you had mentioned earlier that there's an emphasis on, in the Conjuring 1 in particular, that they're all women, right? In the Conjuring 2, you have all women but a young boy.
Right.
And I think, some people can easily say like, oh, well, sadly that makes people feel that sense of vulnerability more, right?
Right.
And I do want to call out that I am a male going forward with this statement and this like approach on this situation, but I think when it comes to the eras that we're looking at, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at the 70s for the Conjuring 1 and the 80s for the Conjuring 2.
Right.
And when you're looking at those eras, we are not as advanced when it comes to moving forward with equality, right? So sad to say, but I could be completely ignorant saying this, but it seems like in the 70s, women are seen as more vulnerable, right? Because it's the depiction of that is existent in that era. And with the 80s too, we're getting better, but that depiction's still there, and young boys are seen as young boys, like they're babies, right? And that is very much existent. So I think that is something to look at, right? It could be more representative of the era, especially with Conjuring 1, because you have them all being young girls and a mother.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people can take the approach that, it's easier to make the entire cast women and girls because, they feel more vulnerable. And I'm not saying that's the case.
Right.
But I think there are audience members out there that may subconsciously feel that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that could be the reason why.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, it's such an interesting experience that you have when you see that particular aspect of vulnerability placed on screen. Because I think vulnerability placed on screen is not an easy task to do.
Definitely not.
And I think that's extremely hard, actually. And I think that's where you see those focal points of, like, let's probably use a woman or something like that to make it seem more vulnerable, where you get it very much in, like, Candyman or Nightmare on Elm Street with Nancy. And then you get this turning point where you'll see something like Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And you're just like, oh, that's a guy.
Yeah.
Or Evil Dead. Oh, that's a guy.
Yeah.
Like, but I still feel vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel that. So I feel like that's a very hard task to achieve. And to be completely honest, I don't even, like, watch horror films this way anyway. Like, I don't watch them based off of vulnerability. And I understand it, but I don't feel it. I never feel the vulnerability behind it because it's always, for me, I'm always like rooting for the villain kind of thing. I'm just like, well, let's see you get out of this one. Yeah. So like I don't see it from that perspective. But when I do, like, have to view it in the case of a child, that's where I feel like things can be a little bit more creepy.
Yeah.
And you get it from certain films, like this movie called Z, which I'm not too sure if you're both familiar with,
No.
but it's about an imaginary friend that this kid thinks about that comes to life. That turns out it used to be his mom's imaginary friend as well.
Mm.
It's actually a fun movie. It's on Shudder. But with going back to a little bit more to James Wan with Insidious, where the whole aspect surrounds the mind of this child. And
Very true.
that's
yeah.
why I think Insidious is fucking genius.
Yeah.
Because you don't really get to interact with this child. He's in a fucking coma. Like, you don't get to interact with him.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you feel for him.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting when you have this moment of sensibility from this particular, I guess, experience as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
It's so fascinating how James Wan places that on screen. And if you go down the line of like the Conjuring universe and things like that, which I definitely do not know off the top of my head, but because after the Conjuring, did we jump directly to the Conjuring 2?
No, I think
Annabelle.
It was Annabelle. That's right.
And with Annabelle, you had a new mother with a newborn baby.
Yeah, that is true.
Mm-hmm.
And on top, which was, man, that did have a really great scare with the running.
Yeah, but you don't really see that all that much, do you? Like newborn babies really being the target.
I mean, Rosemary's Baby.
True, yeah. Classic.
Yeah, they're okay.
But the baby wasn't even born yet.
It wasn't, but let's get deep. Because this is where we get deep. So with that, when there are children and you have pregnancies involved, pregnancies do make things a little bit more scary. I think for me, that is what gets me.
Comes back to vulnerability again, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, it's interesting because you mentioned earlier, Prince, that you understand there's a sense of vulnerability there, but you don't feel it.
Yeah.
And I don't either, but it's...
Yeah, because it's like, fuck these kids.
But I think it's more so of, like, I can empathize that others may be feeling that vulnerability.
Right. And that's just because you're not a sociopath. And but with certain aspects behind how, like, you see where there's children that aren't even born yet.
Yeah.
I think that's very fascinating because there's a great French film that I don't think either one of you can watch, but it's called Inside. And it is probably one of the most brutal things I've ever seen.
Damn.
And it's fucking brutal. But it is probably one of the that made me feel vulnerable. That made me feel like I wanted to dive back into my shell. It's a fantastic movie and it's very well done, but the thing about the French in their horror, they love their blood. And they love their gore. And boy, is it bloody and gory. Ready for that?
Let's go. Let's
do it tonight. But with Inside, that's one of those things that you do see a lot of coming from the perspective of the mom or the person who's about to become a mom. But you're right. You don't get stories like that pretty often. Like another one I could think of is Prevenge, which she's trying to get revenge on her baby. Another one I could think of is also Anything for Jackson.
Oh yeah,
so
great movie.
That is a great movie. And it's these particular movies that you have that aspect of vulnerability placed on it from the pregnancy side, because seeing my wife go through her pregnancy, that's what made me feel, I guess, even more. Because the thing is, I haven't seen my daughter like get hurt or anything. Like she's still not in the phase where she can walk yet, until I start seeing her like kind of bump her head on something and she's like tripping and stuff like that. Then I think I would understand, like, okay, yeah, like I understand like this baby is vulnerable if I were to drop her and things like that. But that's not something that scares me in film.
Yeah.
But seeing someone pregnant, that genuinely terrifies me. Just because, like, I saw everything my wife went through, from the pain, from the morning sickness, from her going through the mood swings. And boys, if you think periods are bad, but it's things like that just make you so intrigued. And for me personally, what really interested me was seeing things like, and bear with me on this one, but like opposite pregnancies. And by opposite pregnancies, I mean like the opposite sex. Mm-hmm. So things like Alien, where and Alien is very interesting because that technically is a birth thing.
Yeah. It is.
In Alien. 100%. And it happened in a man. And then you have it in Mortuary Collection, where it's a literal birthing.
Yeah. Brutal.
It is very brutal. But it is something that always fascinated me. Well, not always, just recently has fascinated me so much so, like with The Brood, or like Cronenberg's The Brood is very intense, but it's just so interesting seeing that aspect of like, what if I was placed in her shoes?
Yeah.
And that's something that is genuinely just like, dude, women are superheroes. Like, oh my god,
They are. 100%.
Like, it's so cool. But and that's what makes me think, like, with The Conjuring, why I didn't feel that vulnerability, because I was just like, no, that's Mama Bear.
Yeah.
Like, she got that shit. Like, no, that's her cubs. Like, dude, this is hers. Like, she got this, and that's why I didn't feel that vulnerability, that sense of vulnerability. And I know they tried to play on it really hard with Roger having to leave, or him not being around, or the mom being the main person afflicted, and things like that. But I was just like, but that's Mama Bear.
Yeah.
Like, this shit ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
She's not gonna allow that.
In contrast, you think about Annabelle, right? And there's that first portion of the film where she is pregnant. And
Yeah.
she even gets attacked and stabbed in the belly.
Right.
Right?
Oh yeah.
And those are
I
those
forgot about that.
moments
Yeah.
where, I mean, I've seen that film so many times, and I remember how much it impacted me the first time. And of course, it hasn't impacted me as hard the subsequent times I've watched it, but it
Sure.
still impacts.
It's still,
right?
yeah, you still feel that.
Because
It
that's
has
like,
that intense scene too, where
Yeah.
like she sees that she hit her own child against like the bed,
The bed, yeah.
yeah.
but in reality it wasn't. But it's those type of mind games of like a mother killing their own child. That's something that's a whole different level of psychological horror.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's like, because it feels like the no territory, right?
Right.
Like, you don't
Right.
mess with that.
Yeah, and you even could take this as far as to Hereditary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, Hereditary, or even if you want to go a little bit deeper, you can think about it in the context of Us, where that aspect of vulnerability was also, for me, not really felt, because I was like, this family, they got this. Like, they'll be fine,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And it's interesting, though, when I'm currently watching this show called Them. It's not out yet. It probably is out once this recording's out. But with Them, it makes me feel a different type of vulnerability because of how this family is portrayed. And it's so interesting of how they're portrayed, because they're in a neighborhood where they're surrounded by only white people in the 1950s. And they're a black family. I should make context. There's a black family who moves to Compton in the 1950s, and they are trying to start a new life. A husband was in World War II. The wife is having psychotic breaks. There's an imaginary friend involved named Miss Vera, and it's so interesting seeing how this family is placed in this situation, and not by force but by choice.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting to me. It's so fascinating seeing something like that. And I think that's what I want from film going forward. I want to see film do something where it takes a different aspect of vulnerability in a different way. And I really have been enjoying these black-led horror films a lot lately because of this aspect of seeing things like just from a different perspective, someone else's eyes. We always see it from children, right? But when you see it from, and this is why I asked the question earlier of like, what about teenagers? Because there is a teenager in the show who is black who goes to a predominantly white school, and you feel vulnerable, because it's grounded. Yeah, and it's that sense of grounded reality that you get. Like, same thing with Tigers Are Not Afraid. Like, even though Tigers Are Not Afraid plays very much like a fairy tale, like, it's still pretty damn grounded. Like, it's just that it was just the kids' imagination is what flowed the story to make it feel like a fairy tale, which is fucking genius.
And I think, especially with like you're talking about teenagers and stuff like that, it's a very thin line between a coming of age story and something that's very impressionable on the person itself and the child, and having that be elongated into maybe their adulthood. And we kind of see that even with like The Shining into Dr. Sleep. Even though there's two different movies, we see how his childhood affected his adulthood. Yeah. Because at that age of coming to age is a very impressionable period of your life.
Yeah.
So,
The Shining is a perfect example. You know, especially when you piece those two films together with The Shining and Doctor Sleep, because you see how, and I just think of Danny Torrance's speech in Doctor Sleep when he's in the AA meeting.
Yeah.
And he is talking about how he would get drunk to feel like his father.
Exactly.
And it's just like, wow.
And
that is like
that's another thing that's
impactful.
played throughout a lot of horror movies too, is the sins of the past coming into the future as well. And it's also maybe kind of like, not really like hereditary, but it could be passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah.
And that kind of trauma leads on to different experiences.
Yeah, that feels more like Relic.
Right.
Right.
The
yeah,
Relic
like,
is a
like
good
that's something that I feel, and that's even goes back to like, these are someone's children.
Right.
Like, this is someone's child. In no matter what age they are, you're still someone's child. And that's what makes that so interesting, where it's just like, it's just children in horror. So fascinating. So fascinating.
A line that stuck out to me with a movie that we both saw during South by Southwest was Off Season, where the mom was talking about when you have these nightmares, it will always stay with you. You can't run from it.
Yeah.
It'll look like an old family member or a friend. It'll always be there.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how these kids are like living through their traumas and
It's true. Yeah.
hardships.
You even think of like his house and stuff like that
yeah.
too. Like, it's just all these particular traumas that are passed down on to so many different levels and aspects and movements and grooves. It's so interesting. So interesting. But that's going to conclude our actual conversation with that there. If you like things like that, our show technically doesn't work that way. We actually do go ahead and pretty much spoil every single aspect of films, where we actually talk and break down films literally scene by scene. Those films that we have talked about inside of our current conversation are technically some we have actually had proper discussions on. So if you are interested in that, you can actually check out Nightlight, a horror movie podcast, wherever you get your podcast. You also can listen on our Patreon as well, which is patreon.com/goodnightlife. And that's night with a what?
Okay.
Thank you so much for listening. You can catch us every Friday at 6 a.m. PST. Have a great festival, everyone.